Okay, I'd like to start by prefacing this presentation with the acknowledgement that I have well too many slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the Serra Chapel and then allude to other investigations I've done in the architectural history at missions San Juan Bautista, Carmel, or San Carlos Borromeo as it's known, San Miguel, Soledad. So when looking at this, bear in mind that perhaps the one piece that I think is most pivotal to an understanding of St. Francis in the Americas is that we discovered the Serra Chapel. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Fray Junipero Serra, he was an individual who, by virtue of his evangelization of California, introduced the first Christian houses of worship in California. Well, the archaeology in this particular case becomes significant by virtue of the fact that the objective of Fray Junipero Serra in the sacred expedition out of Baja California was that they were going to transit from Baja California to Alta California. There was no border then, but the Provincia de California, and in the process make their way to the Monterey Bay, Monterey. And it was at that site that he was to establish the second mission devoted to a Catholic saint. And in this particular case, it was San Carlos Borromeo de Monterey, and the mission founding that he did or established at Monterey was that of San Carlos de Monterey. In fact, the Carmel mission came to be known by him during his lifetime as San Carlos de Monterey. And I'll explain the particulars of that because Fray Junipero Serra entered California, Alta California, with Gaspar de Portola, who was, of course, a commander of the Spanish military. They brought a sacred expedition from Baja California, and this consisted of native peoples of Baja California. And they ultimately had as their objective Monterey. However, they established their first point of embarkation in San Diego de Alcalá. This was a site that was significant, but in the mind of Serra, it was Monterey that was his objective for the evangelization of Alta California. In San Diego, the expedition met with all kinds of difficulties and tragedies. Many of those who had come by ship perished and were in fact Fray Serra's initial actions on behalf of the church was the burial of many of the early colonists to that particular site. He established a small chapel, which was basically a pole and thatch structure, otherwise known as a jacal, and he almost immediately embarked upon the sacred expedition into Monterey. He extended the expedition, and that was their objective. However, they again met with all kinds of travails and tragedy, and it was as a result of the near starvation of his entire pilgrimage that he began a novena, and he began prayers, and it happened that a ship appeared off the coast and saved the expedition. It appeared on the 8th day of the novena, and so from there on out, it would be the tribute to the Saint San Jose that all mission churches in California would be named. So all of them were initially dedicated to San Jose. And that's why I'll make reference to this. The presentation I wanted to give you here today, again, too many illustrations, but I thought my colleagues here at the center would appreciate imagery. As I see, there's imagery everywhere. I'm very much into photography and multimedia, so clearly the connection is there. I call this the cross and the blade. I've also done presentations called the cross and the spade. Not because I'm Latino, but rather because I use a spade in my work to do the archaeology. And this concerns the discovery of the Serra Chapel. I wanted to start with this quote by Alice Kehoe, a prominent American archaeologist, who in the course of investigating archaeological sites in North America that have an indigenous pedigree, she says, and I quote, "It must be stressed that archaeology as the study of human occupation of the American continent is incompatible with the mission of the schools in the USA. Secondarily, she says, material evidence of a non-English pre-colonial past can be permitted only insofar as it appears simple, crude, and a component of nature on the American continent." Again, Alice Kehoe, 1994. The reason I bring this into play here, because over the last couple of days, we've conducted interviews in which I've attempted to address issues in the California missions, and more broadly in the Hispanic tradition in North America. And oftentimes that tradition is denigrated or basically swept under the carpet as an epiphenomenon of American history. Oftentimes it's not alluded to. When I went through school, the only times I ever heard anything about the Hispanic tradition, typically in either an all-white classroom or wherever I happened to be, a place called San Antonio de Valero was the pivot point for discussions of the Hispanic tradition in North America. And of course, the evil Santa Anna and the decimation and the annihilation of Americans housed as Texians at the Alamo was the only point of departure. And it was at those moments that I would often question my ethnicity, because usually the teacher would be looking at me as though I was part of the problem. And I always felt really, once I discovered what the Alamo was, I always felt, really out of place in those classrooms. And it was in part because of that, in part because of a trip to a California mission at San Juan Bautista, and ultimately a quest for personal identity that launched my interest in history, ethnohistory, and archaeology. So I start with this because my experience in public schools was this, that the indigenous and Hispanicist ancestries that I am identified with by virtue of my Yaqui Indian heritage as well as my Hispanic roots was not pertinent to American history. Let's see. I would like to start first with just an attempt to address some of what I just said by virtue of the words of Kehoe, and that is the question of Spanish fortifications. When you think of Spanish fortifications in California or North America, what do you typically think of? Anybody have a comment? What do those look like? Are these...
Well, the fort at St. Augustine is the first one. San Marcos, I think?
Yes, San Marcos and St. Augustine is a formidable structure. It gives the impression of a military juggernaut, an imperial formation that was invincible. And when you look at that, what you get is essentially a sense that what we're dealing with is a militarization of North America that was all dominant. Of course, hand in hand with this, with essentially was the cross and the blade. We have both the military and the religious arms of the institutions identified with the Iberian Peninsula that were key. We look at this image, we see this very heroic image from La Florida. And Florida, of course, is that area identified, at least for most Americans, with anything Spanish. In fact, I might want to note that one of the first churches in North America is in fact in Florida, in San Agustin. They also have the Fountain of Youth. I did buy some of the water, it didn't help. When we think of the mission program in La Florida, what do you typically think of? How many of you were aware that there were missions in Florida? Of course, I would imagine. But the reality is that when you really begin to explore, because we in California like to be very East Coast or West Coast centric, or left coast as some say, and we imagine ourselves the center of the universe. We imagine ourselves as an island. And if you look at the early maps of California, it was depicted as an island. And I won't go into that now, but so we imagine that we have a lock on the missionary program. The reality is there were missions all over North America. And Florida was one of those places where there were almost over 130 missions and settlements identified with that early occupation, beginning in 1554 with the first mission and the first friar by the name of Mendoza in North America. And I might note that it is in this area that we have San Agustin, where we have the fortress of San Marcos. We have a place called Nombre de Dios, which is, in fact, that first church. And I happened to have arrived there a couple of years ago. I have this ongoing negotiation with my family, my two young daughters and my wife, is that I'll go anywhere with them. I'll go anywhere we can go, as long as there's something there related to what I refer to as the Mexican diaspora, and they have to give me at least a day or two to photograph it or to collect documents. And so it was Disney World. My wife had always wanted to go to Disney World. She had never told me that. She doesn't tell me a lot of things, but among them was that wish. And so my daughters were very excited. They wanted to go, and I said, well, I'll go on the condition that you give me a day or two to see the fortifications on the East Coast. And they were very good about it. I spent 2 whole days exploring and photographing these sites. Of course, when we think of fortifications, the initial installment plan is usually something akin to this. These are stockades, typically wooden beams drawing upon natural materials in an area. Of course, this doesn't quite look like Vitruvian architecture, but nevertheless, it does draw upon principles related to military architecture and bulwarks and how best to set them up from the outset. This is what we ultimately end up with, and this is what often people think of. They think of, the Caribbean, they think of coastal fortifications, they think of this massive bulwark of structures intended to oppress, suppress, and encircle the native populations. The site of San Marcos was in fact intended as a site to hedge against British and attacks on the vessels coming out of New Spain or Mexico. Here we see reenactors about to fire one of the many guns there at San Marcos. And I'll just click through a few of these images to also show that places like Fort Matanzas, maybe the name is apropos because here there was in fact a slaughter of Huguenots who had attempted to come into the area, and the entire group was annihilated. But this within the context of wars with the British and other groups who were attempting to make incursions. And this particular site sits out almost on an island, but it was one of a series of fortifications leading along a channel all the way to the area just south of San Agustin, which by this point was a significant population. Here in this particular structure at Fort Matanzas, we had a number of engagements in which the Spanish defended against British warships that had attempted to enter the channel, and they could fire cannons sufficiently that the British decided they didn't want to get any closer. They knew that they would be faced with multiple installations that could very easily take out any of their ships. We have the basic configuration of sites like this. And in this particular case, there is a site just south just north of San Agustin known as Fort Mose. How many of you are familiar with Fort Mose? Fort Mose was one of the first free African-American colonies in North America. Why was it free? Well, the British were enslaving the African populations, and the Spanish were giving refuge to those same populations so long as they wore uniforms and basically served as soldiers in installations to defend against the northern bulwark. They became citizens of the Spanish Empire, and at Fort Mose, this is one of their installations. Here we see in a museum that's been built. The site is largely archaeological now. What we have is a museum devoted to the African-American presence there in Florida, or La Florida as it was known. And you see a number of assaults and attacks that occurred in which the population was literally forced south towards the community of San Agustin so that these groups could kind of reconsolidate and then reestablish their fort. So they were constantly under attack. You might note that there were Indian militias involved in those battles, with both the African Americans and the Indian militias that had joined them against the British on behalf of the Spanish. Here in San Agustin de Tucson, not to be confused with St. Augustine, Florida, we have a recreation of a Presidio complex. So it begins to give you a sense of the very frontier nature of installations in places like the Sonoran Desert, which was, of course, the domain of Father Eusebio Francisco Quino, who, of course, was a Jesuit. We don't hold that against him, but nevertheless, he was one of those who, heroically served as a pathfinder into much of the Southwest. I might note that the archaeology that was done here, you note these foundations here, that's actually where this reconstruction should have been built, because it's in the middle of downtown Tucson. They had to accommodate shifting the reconstruction back several feet. You note the interiors that have been reconstructed to give a sense, murals have been painted to give a sense of what life might have been like in these facilities. And then, of course, you have a series of murals that depict the soldados de cuera. Cuera because they're, of course, wearing leather-jacketed uniforms, which were very effective against arrows, but not necessarily musket balls. When we shift from those characterizations of the military presence of the Spanish in North America In California, what we have is El Presidio Real de San Carlos de Monterey. San Carlos Borromeo was essentially one of those individuals who served as the architect of the Council of Trent. And he, on behalf of the Vatican, on behalf of the Council, basically set in motion the first building codes for churches and other structures in the Americas. And Father Serra saw him as one of his patronal saints, and thereby named the mission, the first mission, which was a joint military and church venture at Monterey, after this particular saint. When we look at this is the facade before restoration. I've been working with these folks for some years. At the very top, we have a depiction in stone of La Virgen de Guadalupe. And it is one of the oldest such stone-cut monuments representing the Virgen anywhere west of the Mississippi. And it remains intact. It was recently restored. In fact, we on the California Missions Foundation Board of Directors paid a good chunk of money to a conservator to get, basically take her to Hollywood and give her the ultimate makeover. And in that makeover, her face was restored in a fashion. And it was all part of a dialogue and discussion that went on for some time, because some restorers who were, well-meaning parishioners decided that the only way to fix her face, because it was eroding away because of the salts, was to put some nails in her face and then put cement and then try to fabricate a face looking forward. Well, for those of you that know La Virgen, at least the one from Tepeyac, she doesn't necessarily face you directly. And so the recent restoration saw that the rest of the figure was very clearly based on the original tilma of Juan Diego, and so they portrayed her accordingly. I might note that this is a site on the National Register of Historic Places, but in their wisdom, the National Register decided that they would only approve the facade of the building as a National Register treasure. And that's not untypical of the way Congress and national parks and other groups have essentially excluded full consideration of Hispanic and indigenous traditions west of the Mississippi. After all, Congress is east of the Mississippi, and we know Congress has a propensity for making all kinds of decisions that are really considered for our well-being. But anyway, this is a painting based on another that I've seen at Chapultepec Castle, in which we see Fray Junipero Miguel Joseph Serra y Abraham, otherwise known as Fray Junipero Serra, after his saint, taking basically the Last Sacrament in a painting that has been attributed to coming as close as possible to depicting Serra in his last days. Elements of the altar, you will note, include the tabernacle, candles, a prayer book, and then a small crucifix right above the tabernacle. Today, we have, courtesy of Harry Downey, a diocesan conservator, a giant crucifix. But if you look at the Catholic record and the church record, portrayals of the corpus of Christ, the body of Christ, the church at one point in the period prior, just about the time of the conquest of the Moors in Spain in the 15th century, sought to minimize the corpus because they were competing with the Muslims. The Muslims do not believe in the portrayal of the body or the depiction of God. And the church began to reconsider its position and role from about the 14th century onward. And so the effort was to minimize, and there were even discussions of eliminating, portrayals of the body of Christ on the crucifix. And so there are periods where it actually disappears. And so what they did in the churches of North America, the crucifix is normally a small affair. It does depict the corpus, but it's been minimized. In the modern reconstructions of some of these churches, we're so proud of our Christian heritage that some pastors have taken to building these gigantic crucifix structures. These are inappropriate for such restorations. Well, the site that I'm referring to here, El Presidio Real de San Carlos de Monterey, and its chapel, is a site that has been represented repeatedly. But a Spanish artist who was aboard a ship entered the area in 1791, returned in 1792. And at that time, the entire Presidio complex, which had been there since about 1770, June 3rd of 1770, was undergoing reconstruction. Here we see a depiction of the latest church, what I call the third church, under construction with its framework of scaffolding. And we see the original Serra chapel with what looks like a thatched roof in the background. You note the Spanish flag, you see the turrets on the perimeter. We see a cemetery area off to the lagoon immediately adjacent to that. And then you see 3 ships in the harbor. The Atrevida was one of those ships that allows us to identify this in terms of the excursion and the landing of 1791. What was this artist doing there? He was part of a Spanish expedition to document the scientific and other botanical interest that the Spanish had in recording this new land. They were also looking for what might constitute the Northwest Passage. So a number of expeditions were undertaken. If you read the work of Engstrand, she talks about scientific contributions by Spain in the New World, something that is often minimized in any discussion of the Spanish role in the Americas. I go back to San Agustin de Tucson and soldiers. These are actually California reenactors. I know a couple of them. And it was funny to see them there because they painted this wall, and right behind it there's a skyscraper. But as long as you're inside, you feel like you're in the middle of a Spanish Presidio. This is a depiction, again, by Cardero. This was just a rough draft from about 1771, in which he shows the Serra Chapel with its small sacristy building in the background. And you see all this tile and what looks like a tile kiln. In the background, we see the scaffolding of the Church of 1794, which is the one that we undertook a $10 million restoration to repair. And I was charged as being, I wasn't charged with criminal intent, but rather as an archaeologist, and some might see that as criminal. We have a number of documents, and there's been a long heritage of collecting documents on this site, but you see representations of the Catholic Church which do not conform to the original footprint of the architecture at the site. We also see the ruins of the magazine, which would have been one of the turrets or towers on one of the 4 corners of the site. We see depictions from 1847 in this case, and we see the baptistry structure that long since disappeared. It was dismantled in about 1857 when they began construction of a transept paid for by one of the early California families, the Pachecos. So, back in 2006, I was called upon by conservators and the program to undertake an archaeological investigation. They were interested primarily on whether or not the foundation of the building was substantial enough to justify a restoration that didn't require a complete retrofit. And so we trenched around the entire perimeter of the building. By the time we were done, I had logged in 14 trenches. And of course, it went all the way around the building. I call them the trenches of the cross, but ultimately it allowed us to interpret the configuration of earlier buildings on this site. We began pulling up horseshoes, ceramics, tiles, handles of various vessels that had been recycled for other uses. We began producing a large body of ceramics that really gave a sense of the very cosmopolitan character of the site. We have Mexican Indian ceramics that the only difference between the Hispanic and the indigenous traditions in the ceramics were that these were tin glazed or lead glazed. Don't eat your parched grasshoppers out of lead-based vessels. Here we see again Mexican Indian pieces side by side with British wares, feather edge, because they were going around Spanish prescriptions against trade with them. Here we see Asian wares, and we found these in abundance. These would have been the kinds of wares that officers would have used. And then of course recycled copper, in this case converted into a smoking tube. And in this particular case, the day we found this, the archivist from the Diocese of Monterey walked around the building, saw that I was examining this object, and I told him what I'd found. He goes, "That looks like a smoking tube." He says, "Just this morning I found a document written by one of the priests in which he complained about the Mexican soldiers of a later period." And he went on and on about why can't they be more like Protestants and not smoke and not drink and not carouse. And he went on and on and on. Well, we found evidence that they were smoking up in the bell tower. Okay, I now move to perhaps the most significant element in this discussion, at least for me, and I think for the project for St. Francis, because this was technically the earliest archaeologically recovered or identified structure identified with Father Junipero Serra anywhere in California. It is also the first Christian house of worship for which we have archaeological evidence that was ever built in Alta California. This is the site, and the way this story began is after my initial investigations at the Royal Presidio in 2006, I excavated a series of units. There were 7 pits dug around the structure by directive of the architectural conservator, and we got into some debates. He's an architectural conservator, but Spanish colonial architecture was not really his forte. I've looked at the manuscripts of the anonymous architect in Mexico City, and they're very clear that Vitruvian architecture and ratios of wall height to foundation depth were inherent in these constructions. No matter how primitive they might look, they were made from local materials, but using techniques that can span all the way back to the Roman period. Well, one day while doing work at Mission San Juan Bautista, because I'm the curator there, I was called by the project director, and she said, "Rubén, did you authorize the contractors to reinitiate excavation around the church?" This was in 2008, after a project that spanned almost 8 months of continuous excavation in 2007, where we recovered thousands of artifacts. Well, in 2008, I received this phone call, and I said, "I've not authorized that." And so the project director said, "I think you better get out here as soon as you can. We might have a problem." And she informed me that in attempting to remove some tile, because I was told there would be no excavation in front of this structure from 1794, the contractor decided, "Oh, well, we found some dark, black, mushy soil, and we've got to remove it. It's not good for, the installation." Well, that dark soil is called midden by archaeologists, and it is the organic remains of human presence on any site. And so, and also she said, "Well, we kind of pulled up a couple of big boulders." Well, the boulders they were pulling up are not native to the site, especially the granite boulders. And so I rushed out from San Juan. I was working with some of my students. I was paying them through a benefactor to rehabilitate the Mission Museum. And I had 2 of my archaeology students, Brenna Wheelis and Esther Kenner. I one day approached them and I said, "We've got all these redwood floors. Would you be willing," I didn't want to offend them, "to do the floors?" They readily volunteered to do that. And so they went through and they rehabilitated all the floors in the museum. Well, I come out here, I find that all this damage had been done. In fact, the diocese is a bit embarrassed by this. We see foundation footings that have been destroyed. We see large stones, and all of this in an area that for me was perhaps the most significant. We knew that somewhere out here, based on Cardero's drawings, there was the original Serra Chapel, and I basically asked them, "Will there be any excavation?" And they assured me that there would not be. Well, when I got there, there had been major digging going on. I then called my 2 students. I stopped the contractors and the developers, and I then called the 2 students in question who'd been doing floors, and I asked them, "Ladies, would you like to do another floor?" And they said, "What floor?" And I says, "The floor of the Serra Chapel," and they immediately jumped on it. And we were out there literally the next day. Well, here you see my students literally recovering materials, initiating the excavation in the area immediately in the forefront of the church. This individual is of Mutsun Indian or Ohlone descent. Well, the developers, to try to get around the archaeologist who was slowing them down, because I do have issues with them destroying historic fabric, and I do slow them down, but I try to keep them moving forward. Well, they hired 2 Indians who they thought could monitor, and so they then used this as their sifting screen with a giant, the biggest earth mover I'd ever seen, and they were dumping the stuff into this grate, and the Indians were collecting the artifacts. And one of them approached me and said, "Dr. Mendoza, I don't feel comfortable doing this. I've never done archaeology before, and they seem to think that because we're Indians, we would know what an artifact looks like." Well, I then stopped that project and told them, "We are going to excavate this area," and they continued. You see this backhoe? They were moving around us constantly. They wouldn't stop the project. And I didn't want to put the diocese in a situation where costs just kept going up. So we continued to work around them. Here you see my students digging right in front of the facade of the third church, dated to 1794. You see my students beginning to recover the pavers, which were granite boulders that were brought from some distance, and they're bringing up the foundations of the original Serra Chapel. Well, here you see the foundation, and this was the area where the sanctuary would have been. This is where the altarpiece, and we found in that one area the remains of the original Roman mortar floor. That was about the only area that retained it. So literally beneath the area where Fray Junipero Serra would have conducted Mass, we found the remains of the floor upon which he once stood. So you can imagine my excitement both as a scientist and as a Catholic, standing there in the place where literally a panoply, an entire panorama of the history of North America in the form of the many personalities and celebrities that once stood in this very church was literally right there below my feet. And so I thought of Fray Junipero Serra, Fray Crespi, La Suen. I thought of de Anza, if you want to call him de Anza, it's actually Anza, and the Vallejos and the Alvarados and all the great personalities of that time all stood right there as they entertained the services of the church and partook of the Eucharist. As we went through this foundation here and exposed the footings, we found, for example, an iga. How many of you are familiar with what an iga is? It's H-I-G-A. Well, you can imagine we found it right in the corner of the church, right next to a doorway. And I got excited. I thought, oh my God, this might be the bell clapper of the very bell that Fray Junipero Serra once rang during church services. Well, later I went to, I did further research on this one item. I went over to the Presidio of Santa Barbara, and there they had the iga on display. And these were basically weights, blanket weights, that were used on the blankets used on saddles. And so this was probably, could have been Anza's, blanket, horse blanket. But nevertheless, these items were among the many that were found here. We also found blue stones, blue granite, which is not indigenous to the area. And I now believe that these stones, literally as part of a sacrament of sort, were brought in the ballast of a ship from West Mexico as part of that continuing effort to move the evangelization forward. Of course, that's all speculative, but it's clear that the granite boulders are not local to California. As we did the work, and there was no additional funding to continue this part of the operation, we were just determined to do it. And the contractors kept asking, when are you going to be out of here? When are you going to be out of here? And they couldn't wait for me to leave. And I just tell them, we're going to leave when we darn well please, and when we determine how much damage you people have caused. They were talking to me in those terms, so I talked to them accordingly. But you see that here is the church that stands today with its 1858 transept. And then we see the church of 1794 with its tower, and you see the relationship of the building. Actually, the building would have been about this is only about 2/3 of the building. It would have extended out into the street, but we weren't privy to excavating in the street. So the excavation, interestingly enough, when I had originally projected the location of the Serra Chapel, I thought about it, and I thought, the minimum distance based on the Cardero illustrations, which show the building very close to the church, I thought it would have to be within 8 feet of the building to allow for the scaffolding and a passage between the buildings. Well, guess what? When we excavated this, the distance from here to the back of the building was exactly 8 feet. Later, while doing excavations and trying to find the sacristy, we found a wall, and I projected a 5 by 8 foot structure, just roughly, based on the Cardero illustrations. And I was 20 centimeters short of the actual dimensions of the building. So I don't know what that's about. Maybe Junipero Serra was speaking to me, but he would have been speaking to me in varas, not necessarily an English form of measurement. Here we see, as we continued the investigation, here you see my stippled lines here that show what I was projecting. I drew this before we actually found it, and then when we did the actual drawing, it fit right over that, and I left the stipple lines to show what I was originally projecting. Sidewalks, And then, of course, a host of buildings began to appear as we excavated and I documented. We discovered the Padres' quarters, the arcade. We found the baptistry of stone from 1810. We found a massive terrace footing, which the site geologist and the engineer basically assured me that the stones that we were finding were natural. They were indigenous. That is not an architectural feature, and we're removing it. I said, no, you're not. This, in fact, he's a structural engineer and should have known that the massive stone under this corner of the 1858 transept, if removed, would destabilize the building. He was determined to move it because he couldn't put his trench through there, you know, the French drain. And I kept arguing with him, so he got on the phone, called a geologist who drove all the way from San Francisco, and as soon as he dropped down into the trench with one of my students asked, so is it architectural or is it natural? And the geologist said, no, this is clearly an architectural feature. And of course, that upset the engineer, and I ended up in bad graces with him. But we saved the foundation, and it was determined this was a terrace, behind which we found massive amounts of trash, ceramics, every imaginable kind of artifact. We then found the adobe sacristy of 1810, and we even found the vestments room that was indicated in early documents. And then we found the soldiers' quarters here, and we even found in the wall a wooden element that the architectural conservator couldn't identify. I looked at it and I said, that's a ridgepole. And that places our building right here, and sure enough, we found the other foundation shortly thereafter. Here you see the Serra Chapel. Of course, it would have been elongated. These are my field drawings. And we have what I projected as the sacristia of 1791, and of course, materials from the excavation proper. I was using forensic numbers because they weren't giving us time to properly record this. So I needed a way to indicate on my maps what we were looking at. Here you see the 1794 structure, which would have been the third church, and here what ultimately we determined to be the second church, and here a view from the tower of that structure under excavation. Interestingly, after we discovered that, the engineers and the developers were intent on running a trench right through the building, and I kept telling them, you're not doing that. And they kept insisting that they had to. They had no choice. I said, you've got trenches everywhere. You can reuse those. And they were unwilling to do that. And ultimately what happened was on the, I was absolutely certain that we had found the Serra Chapel, but you know, I don't rely on my own opinion. I have to base it on other forms of information. And so the project archaeologist said, Rubén, this seems like this would be important, don't you think? And I said, yes, I think it's very important. It would represent the earliest evangelization of architecture identified with the first Christian house of worship. And she said, do you have any references, anybody else that could speak to this? And I said, yes, Jack Williams at San Diego. And so we called Jack Williams. I called Jack Williams and I said, Jack, can you tell me what you would identify as the earliest structure in California identified with the life and times of Fray Junípero Serra? He says, well, typically everybody says, and he says, I've never found it, but he says the structure at San Juan Capistrano, known as the Serra Chapel, in fact, it promotes a lot of tourism, the Serra Chapel is the earliest. He says most people claim that he was there in the 1780s, I think the date was 1778. But Jack said, I think that structure dates to the early 1780s. And yes, he did hold mass there, but he did so shortly before his death. And I said, Jack, if I were to tell you that I've just identified a structure for which we have documentary evidence, was constructed in 1771 and 72, would that be the earliest? He says, undoubtedly. And I then conveyed the information to the project manager. She then called the press, and the next day we had the news media out there, and it became a front page story. And it was interesting to see the look on the contractors and developers' faces. They literally stood there almost in reverence looking at this, and they said, yeah, we're going to run the trench around this. So we won. And then on the last day of the dig, because I thought I would stop antagonizing them, I asked them, I says, will there be any further excavation on this site? Because you need to have a project archaeologist here or you're in violation of a whole host of federal and state codes. Well, they said, no, there will be no further excavation. I said, none? And then they admitted, well, we just have a fire line we have to trench. It's only going to go a couple feet deep. I said, well, then I need to be here. And I says, I can save you some money and some time, but we're going to do it my way, because if we don't, then it's going to complicate our ability to record the information being damaged, essentially. And so I says, if you can get a backhoe operator out here, and I use the forensic numbers, and I work closely with them, we can have it done in one day. And so we did. We trenched this trench basically on the west half of the church. And as we trenched, I would tell the backhoe operator, you're about to strike the foundations of a building. And he'd go, how do you know that? And I said, because I've been studying this site, and I have other maps that would, and sure enough, he'd hit a foundation. And then I'd tell him, you're about to hit another foundation. Boom, he did another one. But then he hit a series of features that I didn't have an explanation for. And interestingly enough, right about in here, we struck what was a decomposed granite footing, which was nowhere on any of our maps. And there were charred posts still embedded. And I realized then that based on the earlier descriptions by Commander Fajes and others, that the church Serra built was built against an earlier structure that had been a warehouse, but that had been converted into the first church on the site in 1770. And they literally held a high mass in there in a warehouse with a provisional temporary altar. And they didn't even have a roof on the structure. They had to place flags of various foreign countries, and I can imagine they used the British flag for the floor mat. But nevertheless, we were able to identify that as the rear wall of the original stockade. And then when I began to map it, I realized this would have been the Serra Chapel based on an early illustration. Well, the illustration is flawed, but we did determine that we were looking at another structure running immediately behind and in alignment with the angle of the Serra Chapel, which was the second structure, and we found the altarpiece of the first such church on the site from 1770. I was very excited. That never became media, but I'm currently preparing another manuscript on that topic. Okay, now I'm going to try to go through this a little more rapidly, just to give you a sense of what we now believe happened on this site. These are based on my original maps and illustrations of the site. And this is an earlier iteration of what I originally did. I was looking for my latest map, and I didn't have it with me, but basically this chapel would have extended out further. So what you have is the first chapel of 1770, built in what was essentially a warehouse, an almacén, and then the second chapel, the Serra Chapel of 1771 and 72, and then of course the third chapel, which is that of the period from 1791 to 1794, dedicated in 1795. I'm now going to go through and give you a sense. This light blue area is the third chapel. This structure was added as a transept in 1858. Okay, when we begin our analysis of this site, we have the first chapel, and we have the original south palisade wall of 1770. Then we add the Serra Chapel in front of, or to the north of, the first chapel. The first chapel then becomes a sacristy, interim sacristy with the missionaries' quarters along the stockade of the south. Then there comes a point where, as Fajes put it, the structure looked out of place. It was in the Plaza de Armas, which is the place where the soldiers would practice, and it just sat out there. Well, at that particular point, they built a new padres and soldiers' quarters, and they left the structure here until they could build the final church. I believe it was at that time in 1778, after building this new defensive perimeter curtain in 1778, that they added the sacristy, because now we had a gap and the two structures were not connected. We then look at the structure from that time. This is a 3D model that we developed to give a sense of what the structure looked like in relation. We began recovering roof and floor tile that was clearly distinct and different and composed from shale, which was some of the footing material. We began finding a lot of marine life associated with the trash dump behind the original Serra Chapel. So for those of you that are pescatarians, you can have heart with the fact that Fray Junípero Serra was eating a lot of fish when they first arrived. I think he very rapidly moved towards a ranchero diet once they brought in enough cattle. We found whalebone behind the Serra Chapel. And then, of course, shortly after that, they built a massive terrace in preparation for the building of the third church made of stone. We have a kind of a configuration, and this was an initial iteration of what I believe was going on. They built this massive granite, cobble, and boulder terrace. Well, this is an exaggeration. We now know that it extended only to here and back. We continued excavations right through that massive pavement and terrace of boulders, and we recovered quite a bit of material. And I was able to date the terrace feature itself because at the bottom of it, not knowing that we were dealing with a terrace, we excavated through all these boulders, and as we did, I had this ex-Navy guy with arms bigger than my torso who would pick up these boulders and set them to the side. We got to the base of it, hit bedrock, and we found this coin dated to 1779. This is a 1 real piece with Carolus, or Carlos III, depicted as a Roman emperor. We found gun flints, maiolikas, and of course, the chapel is ultimately built to the terrace in 1791 to 1795. And this now invalidated the need for the second structure, which I believe was demolished in 1794. But this would have been the relationship of each of those structures at that time. So here we see the third chapel, the Serra Chapel, and of course, shortly thereafter, the structure is demolished. As we excavated around the perimeter, a previous archaeologist who was not familiar with the Hispanic architectural tradition excavated down 2 feet, and when his students hit what they thought was bedrock, he told them to stop. And that left the impression for almost 15 years that the foundations to this church were inadequate. And I kept arguing with the team. I said, that's not possible. They would not have invested this much labor in a structure that was going to come down because of an inadequate foundation. When you look at the seismically astute architectural tradition of Mexico City, we know that they built significant foundation features. They also did earthquake-resistant construction techniques, locking vigas with pegs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We even have at San Miguel, during the course of excavations there, found that the 12-foot deep foundation made of round cobbles was layered between layers of slate where those cobbles could actually shift along the ground during a massive quake. That was being done in colonial Costa Rica. So seismic resistant construction of the type that now the Japanese are famous for. Well, here we see the ridgepole that the architect was unfamiliar with. When I saw it, I knew immediately that we were looking at the ridgepole to the soldiers' quarters attached to the side of a structure. And as we did the vertical archaeology and removed the concrete or the stucco from the sides of the building, we noted that we found original lime plastered features painted to look like large blocks of cut stone. We also recovered murals on the interior of the church. Can anyone identify what we're looking at here? What does it look like to you?
Shells?
Yeah, they look like shells, but what is this here? A trellis. And what would be identified with a trellis? The fruit of the vine. So we literally have representation of the sacrament on the walls of the original church, painted in red as part of a wainscot pattern. But you'll also notice this very dark and almost sinister looking wainscot that was painted immediately above it and over it. We found layer upon layer of paint. I believe, based on other modifications to the third chapel of 1794, that during Bouchard's raid, Hipólito Bouchard was an Argentinian. Lately, Argentinians keep cropping up in the woodwork. The Pope, our campus president, the chancellor of the CSU system were all selected in the same year. A trinity of sorts, but I don't know what it means about Argentina.
They're on the rags.
Yeah, but maybe Madonna will make a comeback, you know. But anyway, this, I believe, is linked to the 1818 raid on Monterey by Hipólito Bouchard, because at that time, the entire complex was burned to the ground, so they would have had access to a lot of charcoal. And what better use of charcoal than to literally take the ruinous remains of the original Presidio and use them as paint to, again, anoint the interior of the church. Also, they modified windows into gun turrets. Clearly, they were now a little paranoid because most of the town was burned because the Spanish soldiers resisted and actually captured several of these privateers, often referred to as pirates. We also recovered a host of animal bone, and I'm currently working with one of my students. She's now a graduate student at Sonoma. I recently re-edited her manuscript so she could report on the cut mark patterns. And actually, she was very astute and decided, well, the only way I can really know about these cut mark patterns is to replicate the process. So she and one of my other students, Jennifer and David, decided that they were going to replicate it. I filmed it and photographed it, and they brought in these big hunks of meat. He was working in a butcher shop. So he brought in these big hunks of meat, and a blacksmith that I've been working with who replicates Spanish colonial hardware actually came in and replicated tools of the period. And then they used them and they just started chopping away and sawing and cutting, and we replicated the cut marks of the bones discovered at the Presidio, and she's about to publish that report. Here we see the terrace, the Presidio chapel, and then of course this is what the site is configured as based on the original illustrations. And then we have the demolition of that structure and what the Presidio chapel would have looked like after 1794. Here we see depictions of the interior quadrangle, and then of course that too was modified, and they utilized the massive terrace built in anticipation of the build out of the church to build a stone baptistry in 1810, and working with an Indian chieftain from the area of Santa Clara. It would be appropriate that they would draw in the Silicon Valley for technology in Monterey. They built the baptistry and the sacristy, and the records show that in about 1811, over 100 natives from the area of San Jose, Santa Clara, were hired to come to the Presidio to build additional structures. And I believe these structures may have benefited from that effort. And you might say, well, wait, the Spanish just took advantage of the Indians. What would they have paid them? Well, the way it was worked out is the commander brought in the chief, and they negotiated prices, and the chief insisted on blankets, clothing, shell, and glass trade beads in large quantities, and access to coastal shell resources. And so that was granted. 100 Indians from the area, Ohlone, came in and continued work on that, and they even had a barracks building where they could be housed and where they could sleep. And all that material went to the chief, and he dispersed it in the community and among the families that were involved. Here we see what I believe would have been the configuration of the adobe sacristy. You see it from above with the stone baptistry and the adobe sacristy. And you note the massive terrace feature. And it was interesting because I showed this to the conservator, and he couldn't figure out something related to this window. He hadn't yet shown me what they had discovered by opening that fixture. And as soon as I showed him these drawings, he said, I just realized why this was done. That window, the window located in this side of the church, was turned into a gun port. Why would they have done that there, here in particular? It was clearly a point of vulnerability into the main fortification. And so it turned into a gun turret, and interestingly enough, it was then modified into a nicho for the placement of a saint. So again, the cross and the blade come into play, and what you have literally is either you protect yourself with a blade or you protect yourself with a santo. And of course, many ceramics being produced on site. I've been working with folks that are doing trace element analysis. I have a student that is using a device invented by an individual who I had the opportunity to meet, a physicist. You just take this gun and you aim it at any object, and it'll actually tell you the atomic composition of that object. It's being used in museums across the country. It's an incredible device, and archaeologists are now coming and obtaining that device in droves. Here we see efforts. We found the ridgepole in the side of the structure. This is Anthony Crosby, the architectural conservator, and we would often discuss information related to this structure, but this pretty much cinched the fact that this was a pitched roof structure embedded in the wall of the third chapel. Here we found additional painting, the fleur de lis, that was painted at that time, and again painted in the wake of the attack on the Presidio in 1818 by Bouchard. One of the things I found myself, because I was on the site every day for months on end, I was participating in the removal of the cement coating on the structure. We saw features that had been modified, like this window, redone by Harry Downey. And actually, in 1858, when they added the transept, they put in Gothic windows. And Harry Downey, who was a staunch Serraphile, said, those don't look like mission windows. So I'm going to change them back. And so he turned them into rectangular windows by adding bricks and plywood and then sealing the Gothic element. After all, the Gothic is Gothic. And, but you'll note that these patterns here that are in the portadas became a major point of conflict, or at least discussion. Tony Crosby, the architectural conservator from day one, was absolutely convinced that these portadas of cut stone were mined or removed from the Carmel mission and brought to this site and put into the walls. And yet we had stories that an Italian craftsman had made them. They clearly were similar, and because I was looking at the iconography and the liturgy of these, I believed that they had some relationship to the main facade and had to have been created on the site. And Tony Crosby disputed that with me. We went back and forth. And interestingly enough, during the course of removing the stucco, I actually found this pattern in the area where the window had been. And I wrote Tony Crosby on my wireless, I had a wireless blog going at the time, early on. And so all the engineers were looking at this and, of course, using it against me from time to time. But I argued that this approximated another pattern right below the portada. And I said, is it possible that the portadas were installed in the church originally and then removed and placed in the new 1858 transept? And he didn't buy that. Ironically, later, while clearing the rest of the cement, they found paint from the interior of the chapel on both of the portadas. And he finally bought the idea that these were actually the entryways to the baptistry of 1810 and the sacristy of 1811. Here we see the window that was converted into a gun turret as it was being reopened. We see the addition of a crypt that was used by the Pacheco family, a prominent early California family. And I date that back to roughly before 1855. Okay, I now move to Tales from the Crypt. After we had done our main investigation, I received a call from these engineers I'd had all these issues with, and they said, Dr. Mendoza, we need you to come back, and we just need you, for enough time to determine if we have a problem in the crypt. Well, the crypt hadn't been opened since the 1940s, and Harry Downey was the last guy in there, and there were all these stories that he had dumped concrete in there because of a water problem, and that the thing was no longer accessible. Well, when they opened and removed the massive marble slab dedicated to the Pacheco family, we discovered otherwise. On that day, we dropped a light into the crypt. We found this destroyed ladder. And this is my student who I work closely with, Adrian Lopez, who now works as a director for Habitat for Humanity, so he's still involved in the building trades. But he's a little short Zapotec Indian. He speaks Zapotec. His grandparents don't speak Spanish. And he grew up in LA, though, so he speaks perfect English and Spanish and Zapotec. And he became a great ally. Everything that I did, he would do. He learned photography because I always carried a camera. And then he kept, basically injecting himself into all my projects. So I thought, you know what, he would appreciate the crypt. So I called him one morning and I said, I've been invited to reopen the crypt. And wanted to know if you'd be interested. He goes, well, hell yeah. And so, of course, we met up, arrived, and we sat above this, and we're looking down in there, and we were waiting for flashlights because we didn't have any. And I thought, and I do this with my students. My training is usually a trial by fire. And so my attitude is that's going to be more memorable than if I do it for them and just simply demonstrate. And so I asked Adrian Lopez, I said, Adrian, I'm going to give you the opportunity to go in first. And he looked down into the crypt, and he looked back up at me, and then he looked down in the crypt, and then he looked back up at me, and he said, no, you go first. And that was shortly after he said that. And but of course, I had my camera ready because he kept looking down, and I had the camera click, and I got him. And as he was saying, literally, "You go first." And then I realized that that was the exact line from Raiders of the Lost Ark when they found the Ark of the Covenant. We entered the crypt, and this is what I saw. In fact, after he said, "You go first," I dropped a ladder in there. I climbed down into the darkness, and I made a point of actually turning off my flashlight. And I just remained silent. I stood at the edge of the crypt, and I didn't say anything. And he's still staring down in there. I could see a shadow dropping into the crypt. And all of a sudden I hear, "Rubén! Rubén!" And I didn't answer him. And then, "Dr. Mendoza!" I think he thought somehow there would be a response. No response. And then finally, he said, "What's down there? Are you all right?" And I said, "Oh, about 7 bodies." And he became even more reticent to enter. And of course, 7's an important number in the Bible, so it's only appropriate that the Pachecos buried 7 of their family members in this crypt. When he asked, "What's down there?" I said, "Well, 7 bodies, but there's still one crypt available." And it was this one. And you'll note that this is part of a bóveda. And I believe that in 1858, they had to build an Hispanic-style bóveda with Vitruvian principles intact in order to reconceptualize what was basically a block room. And how do I know that it was a square room or crypt? Before they built the transept, I found redwood planks in one corner that had been preserved when they built the bóveda. So I believe that the Pachecos had this crypt probably from about 1815 to 1820. And then when they built the transept in honor of their deceased son, they had to reinforce it, so they built a massive bóveda and then built this massive structure over it. All of these were filled in with American-era brick, so I know that the crypts likely had the caskets and maybe some minor feature. We found pieces of wood, nails, that clearly held the names of each of these people on the walls of the crypt. And then this brick was clearly later. And according to Harry Downey's accounts, the conservator, who entered this in the 1940s, when he entered the chamber, after it had been sealed for all those years, they found water damage, and they actually found the casket of Father Casanova, who did all kinds of restorations in the 1890s. They found it overturned on the floor. It had literally been floating in there from all the water. Well, he decided to put him in a proper place, so he entombed him in the crypt. But he left one brick out, which was Harry Downey's way of checking in on Father Casanova from time to time. And we actually found Father Casanova's name written right on the crypt wall. Here we found candle holders, the interior of the crypt, which were roughly 10 feet tall, long, and then we found the redwood planks and a crucifix. This is me in the excavations. We excavated a very shallow trench around the perimeter, and we determined that there was very little mud infill. So the engineers were able to go about restoring this structure. So they built the transept of 1858, and this is what the building would have looked like with its Gothic windows in relationship to the infill of the original windows of the 1794 structure. Interestingly enough, they also installed German stained glass windows from the 1850s. They're all now in Central California in a replica of this church, which is largely made out of corrugated metal. One of my students tracked those down. So if we go back, the first structure, palisade, the Serra Chapel after its detachment from the barracks, the construction of the terrace, the building of the third chapel, the additions of the baptistry and sacristy, the addition of the crypt, the addition of the transept, and then, of course, the overall conglomeration of buried structures in relationship to the structure in blue that is the one that you see on site today. Okay, just a few ancillary findings, and I know that looking at pretty artifacts is not the way you had planned to spend your day, but I did want to point out a few additional items. For example, this Asian platter, a Maiolica bowl, and 2 shovels from the 1858 restoration, which I thought was ironic because they were buried in the backfill of the adobe sacristy. We found British earthenwares that had been jammed into the sides. It's almost as though they had these nice pieces of material, but they're British. And as they were building the structure, they would put them in there and they would smash them with the scaffolding that was being installed as they built the structure. We found holes like this throughout the building that once held the scaffolding. We found a lead plumb bob from an earlier restoration. We found fiber. We found interior windows that had not been fully revealed in earlier studies. And then Tony Crosby would call upon me and he asked, Rubén, we have a problem here. In this window well, which dates to the original building, we found blue fabric. And there's a wire cut nail, which would have dated from the late 1800s. And what I suggested to him is that, like the big envelope or tent they placed over the building to keep water out, that probably in this late 1890s, a restoration by Father Casanova, he sealed the windows with this material, and that would explain why the nail was there. And he ultimately agreed with that assessment. And finally, we dedicated the chapel. They had a hell of a time raising the almost $10 million for the restoration. And all the project work, including the marble pavers that were installed and that show the points of where the Serra Chapel and all the other buildings are engraved into the marble pavers. Unfortunately, landscape designers like symmetry. Well, the Serra Chapel was off alignment with the existing church, and they argued with me. I said, if you want to be correct in portraying to the public where the Serra Chapel was, these are the points. And they didn't agree with me. They placed them, but they're out of kilter. And so one's here, one's there, but they're aimed north and south in alignment with the church. Of course, the bishop, a Mexicano bishop, a Mexican-American from Sacramento, Richard Garcia, was there to actually dedicate it. He had just been appointed. He saw through the completion of with the exception of the facade, which is now complete, and we undertook the actual dedication. Here we see the restoration and reinstallation of La Virgen, and you note the date 1794 with the 4 depicted as an upside down 7. And I might note that when we pulled this out of the facade, we actually found the mason's marks, literally grooves, channels cut through the edges of the statue, of the stone piece. And interestingly enough, when they installed it, the only thing we found to hold it in place were wooden pegs, these small pieces of material that had been jammed in there. And you can imagine in a moist environment, those pegs would always hold that in place. And then lastly, they put stucco around it, but there was nothing holding it in place, not in the way of tenons or other related things. As we were finishing the project, we kept finding things. And we found this structure, or this monument from 1905, dedicated to the Junipero oak, under which the earliest mass in California was held in 1602 under the expedition of Vizcaino. And that was in the wake of Cabrillo's discovery of San Diego and the exploration of areas to the north, including the Monterey area. And that oak was also the oak under which Junipero Serra held mass, initial mass. And so some take it to be the first chapel. I don't, because it was not formal architecture. Okay, I'm just going to skip through some of this. I want to take you to some other images. But the project I've been working on at San Juan Bautista, and I showed some of these images yesterday, is invariably linked to the work that we did at the Serra Chapel at Monterey. Interestingly, Father Ed Fitzhenry he was one of these people that wanted to build. In fact, one of my benefactors said that he's got an edifice complex. He wants to build and build and build. He's a Philistine, and we've got to watch out for him. But I want to respect the pastor. He's the administrator, and so I tried to work with him the best I could. And one day he decided he was going to build a new gift shop, or a new bathroom facility. Since he shut down the earlier one, it became a major problem. And so he decided he was going to put it at the end of a 1932 rectory building. And he informed me that there was no need for an archaeologist. And I said, no, Father, you're going to need an archaeological report on that part of the site. And he kept arguing with me. And I said, Father, you're going to need an archaeological study of that site. He goes, no, I want you to write a historic structure report on the concrete edifice from 1931 and 32. And I did that, but I kept telling him, you're going to need an archaeological assessment. He goes, why? You've dug everywhere else. And I said, that's not the point. The point is that I haven't dug there for one, and second, this is an historic site and you need clearance. Well, ultimately what happened was he wanted to put the toilet right there. And I said, okay, this is a man that liked challenges. I said, Father, tell you what, you hire a backhoe operator, you hire 2 of my students to process the material, and I'll donate 2 of my 2 days to investigating this area, and I'll do it pro bono. And he agreed, especially the part about me doing it for free. And so we started trenching, and as we trenched, we immediately hit the foundation features I'd already warned him about. But then we hit another structure here, and as we started trenching along here, I said, Father, we found a building. He goes, how do you know it's a building? And I didn't want to say, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I would know that's a building. And instead, I tried to explain to him, when you see a linear alignment of stones dug into a trench, and you see teja roof tiles and floor tiles on one side of it, and sterile soil on the other, you're looking at a building. Well, he was about to do mass, and we found this at the end of the day. He was in his collar, and he literally got down on his knees with his black slacks, and he's down here with a trowel trying to determine that it's not a building. And he finally wrote me that night. He says, how is this going to affect the building of the bathroom facility? I said, Father, if this is the building I think it is, it may be the mother church of San Juan, dated to 1797. And if that's the case, you're going to need to move the building. Otherwise, it's a sacrilege. And he continued to tell parishioners that it was not a building. And I kept telling parishioners that it was. And ultimately, when we got the dimensions of the original informes reports showed that it was a 42-foot long building, exactly the length of the building we found, and right before the well feature that we now have dated to 1800, and which we're in the process of restoring as we speak. Well, anyway, this would have been the configuration. I showed this yesterday. Ironically, and these 2 images are here for a reason, this is the Royal Presidio, the Serra Chapel, and I've already told you the story of its discovery. Interestingly, the day we discovered the mother church of San Juan Bautista, it happened 1 year to the day of the discovery of the Serra Chapel. The Serra Chapel, July 29th, we discovered it. July 29th, we confirmed its existence. I was in San Juan when I had to rush out to look at the damage. And as it turned out, exactly 1 year, on July 29th of 2009, we discovered the mother church of San Juan Bautista. And we are presently building a faux foundation and a commemorative marker to note that fact. So I guess in the end, the former priest is, he didn't quite win the argument. I don't have the need to win arguments, but I do need to protect the features that we do find. Ultimately, this site, and I'll show you this briefly, we discovered 2 quadrangles. How do I know that? After 18 years of excavation, ethnohistoric study, and archival research, we were able to find both buildings, the mother church, the well, and the interior quadrangle that collapsed in the earthquake of 1800. When we, ironically, after all those years, I didn't have resolution. It's like a relationship that doesn't have closure. You're left with, okay, well, that's not finished. Well, in the end, or maybe it is finished, especially relationships, but it doesn't have an explanation. Well, one day, while I was doing a PBS interview on the site of the church, there were some workmen out on the street, and there was all this noise being emitted. And you who do multimedia know that that's just not acceptable. That noise factor is going to drown out the speaker. And well, the producer decided he was going to go ask these gentlemen if they would stop. You don't do that to workmen in San Juan Bautista. This is a rural community. At the very least, you will find yourself in bad straits. Well, the producer went out there and suddenly the noise stopped. He came back and I said, how did you pull that off? He says, I told them that we were working with the archaeologist. And they said, we need an archaeologist. We're excavating and we're waiting for an archaeologist to come up from Salinas, but he's not going to be here for a couple of hours. And so I told them that you might be willing to come out and see what they're doing, since there's an archaeologist on site. And so after, I'm dressed almost exactly like I am today in black clothing, and I walk out there and there's this very muddy, pit with water in it, and they suck all the water out, and I jump into the trench, and I see a foundation footing, and I'm thinking, what is this? It's in the middle of the street or off to the side of the street, and I'm thinking, could this have been another building linked to the mission proper? And just as I was about to get out of this pit, I realized, wait a minute, we found a massive foundation footing in 1995. This is years later. This happened in 2010. In 1995, we had found this massive foundation footing that we couldn't explain next to a very narrow one. I then thought, wait a minute, I need the location of this feature. And so I asked one of the workmen, can you take this tape measure and run it over to that area where that foundation footing is? And he did. It was precisely 42 feet, which was the width of the granary of 1802, built in the wake of the great earthquake of 1800. It then explained that the granary, the structure we found earlier, was the granary of 1798, destroyed in the earthquake, and they built the next granary over it as a massive structure that spanned the entirety of the street and was 42 feet wide. That finished my architectural history of the site. Otherwise, I'd still not have closure. And all of this was fortuitous. This site grew by accretion. The earlier quadrangle, you see the build out with the almacén and granary on the street, and then the building of the sacristy of 1803, and then the build out of the chapel of 1809. Of course, this structure has long been called the Indian jail because we want to perpetuate that early American myth that all the Indians would be locked up in this building. Well, it turns out that that was the interim sacristy of 1809, later became a hayloft, and in the American period, a group of American Indians during the fiesta decided that since they were the choir, they didn't want to be tempted by partying, and they asked the priest to give them the keys so they could lock themselves in there for the night so that they could sing in the morning for the Mass. Here we see the build out of the church of 1812, the arcade, the cuartel of 1814, and the so-called drip line or addition of a massive arcade made with fired tile. So when we look at overall what we've discovered at San Juan, combining it with the report I just completed on the architectural history, we have a much more complicated history and tradition in this one community that has often been argued to have only had a church and a single convento or a structure that was never completed. The reality, it's all there. It's right below our feet. And so just because it's hidden from our view doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And one could argue that's the way faith works. Thank you. Any questions?
Rubén, those developers were working for the priest, right?
At the Royal Presidio, yes. And the priest was very supportive of my intervention, whatever that required. So was the project manager. But you have to bear in mind that they've got heavy equipment out there. They have a whole host of contractors out there. There's a lot of money being spent, and they're being limited to the contract. They don't care about what's in the way. In fact, the engineer, unfortunately, and I don't want to disparage unnecessarily, but we have a volunteer who's brought in his own teams, but he's volunteering, but nobody else is. And they were put in charge of Carmel, and now they're moving to San Juan Bautista. And so, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of damage to historic fabric that's buried insofar as these sites. But, he's well-meaning, but he doesn't appreciate the historicity of the sites. And we almost lost the Serra Chapel, the first Christian house of worship, because of some of these very poor decisions. So, I wanted to show, oh yes.
You may remember my book ends in 1350, I mentioned yesterday.
Yes,
so
yes.
I'll display some ignorance here. I was under the impression that the Franciscans were in California much earlier.
No.
But
1760,
you mentioned that I believe the
1769.
earliest mass in California was 1602?
Yes, that was Vizcaino. Vizcaino was a Portuguese, basically he was a merchant, and he had an arrangement with the Viceroyalty to map the coast of Baja and Alta California in exchange for pearl concessions. And I've actually seen the original documents for that. And so he landed in Monterey. And you need to bear in mind that, the Spanish actually had shipboard chapels. And this is an element that we're bringing into our 14th Colony workshop with an investigator who's been documenting these in grand detail. And so you would have had a chaplain, a friar, who would have accompanied Vizcaino. And when they arrived, they went to this oak tree, which was the only place of refuge, and they actually held the first Mass in 1602. They also installed a cross, and interestingly enough, when Serra entered the area, they too installed a cross, and the Indians began placing food at the base of the cross as an offering.
But why do you call the Serra Chapel is Franciscan?
Yes.
And it's the first,
It is the first Christian house of worship in California.
not just the first that's been documented
It
archaeologically.
is the first, because if you look at the records, and we can talk to Jack Williams about this, they have never found anything substantial at San Diego related to the first church. And actually, not long after they built the first church, almost a decade later, the site was destroyed in an Indian uprising.
So they clearly weren't there like in the 1600s.
No, they were not.
And all the famous California missions that the Franciscans
They were all
had
built within a span of 50 years.
in the 70s?
Beginning in 1869 with,
Oh my
not
God.
1769.
That's straight
Serra,
up and down
yes,
the coast.
Serra crosses from Baja California into Alta California, and there at San Diego de Alcalá, which had been explored by Cabrillo. In fact, he died shortly after that discovery. There was a temporary jacal built there, and then he had to deal with the devastation of that community, and he was burying the dead all year. And then he moved immediately and swiftly to Monterey because their original plan was basically to settle Monterey with a joint military and religious expedition. And so that chapel, the one of 1770, which was essentially a jacal, was then the first formal church structure was then that of 1771-72, which is then later documented by Pedro Fages, the commander of the fort, that Serra helped have. He literally had him fired because of his interaction with the Indians. So there was one other image I wanted to show you, and it's gonna. Let me just let's see, because I've been working at other sites. Right now, I'm working at Mission Soledad, and so I wanted to give you a sense of what we've discovered there. This is a GPS mapping of the mission that my students and I have worked up. And this is the mission proper. This is where the church would have been located. The barracks building would have been here. And there was a sacristy, which we recently discovered here. Well, for years, archaeologists have been coming in, both professional and avocational, trying to find the neophyte quarters. Where were the Indians living? And in an early illustration, it shows the Indians in 3 rows of buildings here. An illustration by Oriana Day shows an Indian village here. And Paul Farnsworth, who did perhaps the most exhaustive economic history of this mission, wrote his thesis on this, and he talked about the political economy of the place. And in the process, he ran and dropped about 30 pits in this field, thinking the neophyte quarters was here. He found tons of artifacts, but never found the neophyte quarters. Well, the mission is about to, the Mission Restoration Committee is about to undertake the restoration of this entire complex. And I've been working as a volunteer there, and they recently hired an archaeological firm from the south to pull together all the threads and do some additional testing. The irony is that they paid them $160,000, but for free, I've been able to find all the buildings that they were looking for. I know, the irony of it all. But anyway, I was out there, and they brought in prospectors, people, geologists, who brought out magnetometers. They brought out resistivity meters. They brought out ground penetrating radar, and each time it's like $10,000 to $15,000 a pop. Well, I thought, they found nothing. They haven't found anything in this field. Everybody thought the original neophyte quarters was buried under this road because they got readings of anomalies that might be there. And I thought, okay, how can I find these buildings? The only thing I have going for me is that I have students who have no choice but to work with me after they've matriculated in the course. And one day I was thinking about it, and I thought, you know what? I wonder if metal probes, steel probes, might get us to where we need to be, since they're not finding these buildings. Clearly, there are no magnetic properties to the foundation stones there. I could have told the geologists that, but they went ahead and did all these surveys. Well, one day I decided, once I got some student fee money, I went out and bought about 10 steel probes, which have rubber handles in case you hit electrical lines, you know, and they have points on them that you can replace, and they're about yay tall, and they're like hell to push into the ground. But I figured the field had been plowed, and so I got my students to measure off the field, and we set up a series of transect lines. And I told the students, your first project is to find the buried buildings of the neophyte quarters.
To pass the course.
Yes. So they broke up into teams, about 3 and 4, you know, 1 recorder, 2 people to drop the probe. And I sent them into the field, and I said at every 1 meter intervals, all the way to the area that we can arrive at, which was this road, I want you to drop the probe, and every time you get resistance, I want you to record the depth. And then I want you to push through the resistance until you hit rock. Well, we went through the whole field, and before you knew it, I had teams assigned here, here, and here. And it wasn't the easiest thing to do, and you saw that area. We ultimately, through a trench that I ran through here and an excavation here, we found the corner of the building that aligned with an old property map that we found. Here, I excavated a trench, and we went through a south wall, we went through a hearth, a floor, and a north wall, and we now knew, oh, that kind of shifted there, let's see. Let me shift back, let's see, hold on. I think this is on a timer. And we were working in the muddiest conditions imaginable. Oops. As you can see. But here, we found the hearth. So we knew the building actually ranged into the field. Everybody was looking over here and out here. And we were able to reconstruct to the exact dimensions. We discovered the barracks buildings, and recently we found the sacristy, and all with steel probes, and all for the price of $15 per probe. So it was a real value. And this is what we've done to reconstruct the complex, the buildings, the Sanka or canal. And recently, and this is the biggest irony, after paying $40,000 to an ethnohistorian to check archives in the region, that archivist or that investigator went to the Monterey County Historical Society and found an old paper bag. And on the other side of it was a map drawn from memory by one of the descendants of the Soberanes family. And on that bag, they had a reconstruction that matches almost identically my map here, including the location of the Zanja, the El Camino Real, and the break to the left in the Huerta. It's virtually identical. But I didn't live in those times. I just know from using steel probes that the buildings are there.
So, Rubén, I guess those 2 Franciscan donkeys over there commemorate the compensation that you got.
Yes. Yeah, it's always the troublemakers that make it a history. I mean, we're not well paid as troublemakers, but nevertheless, you know, I continue to work with the Soledad Restoration Committee. I continue to volunteer my time. We camp out there, we do what we have to, but for me it's more valuable, you know, yeah, I could use the cash, but on the other hand, the joy of discovery, the excitement of discovery for my students has been tremendous.
Where is this located?
Soledad is located approximately a half hour south of Salinas. And typically, if my students need transportation, I drive 25 minutes to the campus, pick them up, and then I drive the back road, which is 45 minutes to get them to Soledad.
It's not on the coast.
No, it's on the interior, and it's essentially, and ironically, I introduced an Esselen leader, Esselen Indians of the area, were unaware that this was one of their missions. And interestingly, the day that I introduced her to the site, I showed her the documentary evidence. She literally was in tears, and she did a walkthrough and a blessing with sage, and she thanked me for that, and then later turned on me and brought a group out to say that we have this evil archaeologist digging up our ancestors' holy ground. So
Let me ask you a question that I think would be important both for me and maybe for Justin as well. Would this particular mission be part of El Camino Real de California?
Oh, yes.
Or would that be El Camino Real Adentro?
There it is, El Camino Real de California.
Oh, it's right off.
Yeah, it literally, the El Camino Real runs straight through. Part of the reason I projected that the Zanja, or the canal, which was almost 15 miles long, and we discovered a portion of the aqueducto, as an old-timer put it. In fact, we were talking one day. He said, "Oh yeah, I remember the mission. I remember we used to play in the aqueducto when I was a little boy." And I said, "Did you say aqueduct?" Paul Farnsworth spent a decade trying to find it. And I said, "Could you show me where the aqueducto is?" He said, "Sure." And he took me out, and sure enough, we found it. I later took Paul Farnsworth out, and there's a berm. That's the only thing that remains of the aqueduct, dug. And after that aqueduct was installed, that mission, which had been faltering all the way up to that time, suddenly boomed agriculturally and in terms of its ranching tradition. But the El Camino Real ran straight through it. That I can confirm from plat maps in the 1850s done by the Americans. But I assume, based on the fact that this was the mission where the first medical treatise ever written in California was first published, and it was written there at Soledad. And can you imagine, what was that medical treatise about? Anybody have an idea? You know, after all, these were Franciscans persecuting the Indians. So what would that medical treatise have been for?
C-sections.
Correct. Caesarean sections. And why might Franciscans who have an interest in caesarean sections?
Save the baby.
To save the babies of women who have died in childbirth. And one could, if you want to be really cynical, like some of the people that have confronted me about this, you'll say, oh, they were just saving the babies so that they could control them well into the future. But they say in that very document that the idea was to save these Christians, to save these children so that they might grow into citizens, into parishioners, into those that upheld the faith in California. So, one could say there's a mixed agenda there, but they were clearly concerned. And also, for those of you that are not aware, there is documentation that the Franciscans in California actually maintained quarantines on missions where there were, which were part of the larger system. When an outbreak occurred, like in San Jose at one point, the mission at San Juan Bautista was quarantined, and no Europeans were permitted to come into that community. So while there are those who are cynical enough to claim that the Franciscans sought the annihilation of Indian life and tradition, the reality is they were busy protecting them from everything around them, from other Indian tribes that were hostile and would kidnap children from these sites, all the way through to European diseases that were actually being spread in large part by the swine brought in by, and I don't mean human swine, but rather pigs that would go feral, and then, as today, they get into the agricultural fields and help spread disease that do decimate, people today. The other thing I might note, and I noted this in the interview, is that the Franciscans were doing something that's almost unheard of in colonial America. Whether you're talking British America or Spanish colonial America, they were actually administering inoculations and vaccines to the Indians. How many of you were aware of that? Do you know how expensive it was to administer such an inoculation in the late 17 and early 1800s? The Franciscans were doing that. They were trying to save, their communities, their indigenous brothers and sisters by virtue of inoculations. And even the British weren't doing that. The Americans weren't doing that. But they did seek this in these, lowly indigenous communities where the only recourse was the decimation of Indian population. At Mission Soledad, what's been determined based on the archaeology of neophyte quarters, it's very clear that in tandem with the Hispanization of the Indian populations of California, there was a Mexicanization. And I have a chapter in press in a book through the University of Arizona Press. That book is, I've just been told, will be in print in February. And it's the entire book is indigenous missions in the indigenous landscape. And my chapter deals with Soledad and the extent to which the native Californians of Soledad essentially were Mexicanized. And they became essentially walking, talking Mexicans. We found metate fragments for grinding corn. We found evidence of Mexican diets. We found Mexican Indian ceramics. We even have documents from that era in which the Indians are all speaking Spanish. and they're dealing with the alcalde in Monterey, and they're actually voting to determine if they're going to join the Mexican Republic during that takeover. So the Indians had agency. If you look at the documents from the missions of San Antonio, Texas, where I'm doing work with the World Heritage Committee, we have a manuscript that's been translated that came straight out of the archives of the Zacatecan Friary. And it is basically a guide to how to found a mission. And did you know that the Indians in those communities, and the Zacatecan Friars had broad, kind of a broad swath of jurisdiction in the Southwest, the Indians were permitted to vote. They voted for their leaders, their alcaldes. And when there were more than one tribe, the voting, the democracy of that, entailed switching between one tribe and the other for voting on a leader that represented that group. But they voted with paper ballots. They also have in the registries that the friars are giving the Indians chocolate, which was a highly prized commodity, and they're providing all the needs of that community. And it's clear from emerging evidence within archaeology, ethnohistory, and a whole host of other sources that clearly the notions that the Franciscans were these indomitable, oppressive individuals is clearly incorrect. And I think that to continue espousing that view and making the Indians out into little more than victims addresses a collective martyrology in which we're dealing with the politics of the present to represent history, but we're not dealing with the realities of the past to address what it was that the American Indian did as part of their own, whether you want to call it self-serving or survival strategies. The reality is they did have agency, and they did have a role in their own destinies, even within the California missions. So.
Could I just ask you, for the sake of the project, I'd like to get this on video, I didn't have a chance. If you could just explain El Camino Real de California versus El Camino Real Adentro.
Oh, okay. We in California like to claim that we have the El Camino Real, and so does SciArc. But the El Camino Real was part of a much larger system of a network, and it would be like saying, oh, the Inca Road in Peru extends from point A to point B. That's not true. There were 20,000 miles of Inca roads that were part of the jurisdiction of the Inca Empire. Well, by the same token, when the Spanish began to draw upon the same routes and trails and road systems, many of which extended all the way back to the formative period in Mexico, or the classic period when they had masonry roads. The reality is the Spanish drew upon those road systems, and those road systems were under the jurisdiction of the king. And as a result, there was taxation, there was control of commerce on those roads. And so the systems were vast, and they extended throughout the northern frontier, areas like the Southwest. Santa Fe was connected by El Camino Real del Adentro, which was an ancient system running from Santa Fe all the way to Mexico City. Recently, one of the directors of the Spanish Colonial Heritage Project for the National Park Service just wrote a book in which he literally traversed the entire route and documented the whole thing ethnohistorically and in terms of a guide to that road. The ANZA route, the route taken by ANZA into California, is another one that was part of that larger system. The roads from San Blas, which were part of a point of disembarkation for journeys and expeditions to the north, and of course the El Camino Real de California. You also have the Camino Real that extended into Texas and encompassed the missions of that region, and then you have all these spur routes that were part of that. The El Camino Real de Adentro was a major trunk line into the Southwest, and the National Park Service has sent me all these maps that show all these routes as part of this larger system. And you have the El Camino Real de California, but there were two routes. There's also the El Camino Viejo, which extended from Pacheco Pass through the eastern flank of the coastal range of California and through Grapevine Pass. And at the south end of that is the community of San Emigdio, which we now believe was an asistencia, or a mission church for the Indians of that region in the Central Valley. And it had 30 adobes and a chapel. And I interviewed the historian who found it, and this gentleman recorded it in photographs. And when he saw it, the remains of the church were still standing. There was a big cross. And not long after he saw it, the land company that owned the land decided to bulldoze it because they didn't want tourists out there. they were finding Mayolica ceramics from the Spanish colonial period. And we now believe that that community, which has recently been subjected to archaeology, was in fact one of the earliest Hispanic communities in the Central Valley. So,
San Javier de Bac then would be on the road from central Mexico
Yes.
to Santa Fe.
yes, well, it's actually another trunk line. I mean, not a trunk line, but one of the spur routes that extended into the northern frontier. Of course, it was pioneered by Eusebio Francisco Quino. And if you look at the missions, virtually all of them were interconnected all the way into the Valley of Mexico, which was the seat of the viceroyalty. So the picture is a lot more complex than we often attribute to Spanish colonialism in the Americas. And when you look at it archaeologically, ethnohistorically, economically, politically, religiously, you get a very rich picture of what actually happened. The problem is that with the internet and with our tendency to blog people to death for putting out ideas that you don't agree with, and then finding the facts that support your erroneous views, the reality is it's going to be a big challenge to dispute ideas related to the leyenda negra, because we often subvert any facts that detract from our key argument that somehow the Spanish are more evil than the British or other groups that were out there. The reality is we're human beings, and whether we're looking at indigenous societies or we're looking at Europeans or Asians or Africans, the reality is we can all be very self-serving, and oftentimes those who follow in the wake of those with good intentions are often the perpetrators of some of the most abysmal and horrible crimes. So.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ring the bell for lunch.